With the lower limb, and I'm going to talk about the arteries and veins. So before we start, I just want to make it clear that this is going to be the anterior and this is going to be the posterior. We're going to talk about the right leg only. Remember in the body that we are symmetrical, so whatever I talk about on the right side is exactly on the left side, but for demonstration and video purposes, I'm just going to talk about the right leg. So before we begin, I'm going to just show you. If we have the heart, blood flows out through the heart through the aorta, right? From the aorta, it's going to flow through an aortic arch, right? Out through the aortic arch, it's going to flow down, because we're talking about the lower limb. It's going to flow down to the abdominal aorta. And through the abdominal aorta, we're going to bifurcate, so we're going to split in two directions, into a common iliac artery, and we're going to bifurcate into a right, because this is going to be the right side, and a left, common iliac artery. So this is going to be the right side, this is going to be the left side. So the flow chart we're going to talk about. Remember I talked about the heart. It comes from the left ventricle through the aorta, aortic arch, thoracic aorta, into the abdominal aorta. Okay, so the abdominal aorta is now going to bifurcate into two different areas. We're going to go to the left or right common iliac artery. Remember we said anything on the left side happens on the right side because our bodies are symmetrical. So I'm going to branch down and I'm going to go left or right. For purposes of the board and the way I could draw, I did the right side of the body. Doesn't matter. Let's also remember for arteries diverge, right? They diverge into different things. So we could start here and then we could branch out like this. Do, right? That's how arteries work. They're like branches. Veins, however, are going to be the other way. They're going to come up, two different things, and they're going to come together, right? They're going to converge. Arteries are going to diverge. But I'm going to talk about veins later. I'm just going to talk about arteries right now. So we have the left or right common iliac artery. For our videos, I said we're doing the right common iliac artery. Okay, so the right common iliac artery bifurcates into two different regions. Internal iliac or external iliac? Okay, good. The internal iliac is then going to branch into four regions. It's going to go to the superior gluteal, inferior gluteal, internal pudendal, and the obturator artery. I'm going to discuss where they innervate and the functions later, but I'm just going to talk about the flow chart. Okay, so the common iliac artery also branches into the external. So we have internal and external. The external progresses down the leg, right? And it goes into the femoral artery. They're the same thing. All this side is the same. However, we have different names for the different locations on the body they are. So this is at the femoral artery. The femoral artery is now going to divide into three different regions. It's going to divide into a genicular, a popliteal, and a profunda femoral artery. Okay, so let's take it from the top. Abdominal, common iliac, external or internal? External, femoral. Femoral, three different regions. Okay, one of the regions is the deep femoral artery. It's known as the profunda femoral artery. All this means is that it's a deep artery in the thigh, in the femur region. Okay, now, the profunda femoral artery could branch into three different things. It could branch into the medial circumflex femoral artery, or the lateral circumflex femoral artery, or the perforating arteries. Okay, remember the upper limb. The upper limb we had a anterior and a posterior circumflex humeral artery. Humeral for being in the arm. This is the same thing, works in the same exact fashion, wraps around the surgical neck of the femur, not the humerus this time. Okay, instead of being anterior posterior, we call it medial and lateral. Same thing, circumflex around, anastomosis together. Remember what anastomosis was? An anastomosis is the joining of two arteries. Okay, so now, the popliteal side of the femoral artery, we go external femoral popliteal. Popliteal could form two different regions as well. It could bifurcate again into the anterior tibial or posterior tibial. Remember what tibial is. We have two tibias, two fibulars, because we're symmetrical. The tibia is on the medial side. Remember, tibia together. Okay, the tibias are together. And then fibular, far apart. Fibula for far apart. F, far apart. It's going to be on the lateral side. Okay, so the popliteal is coming from the posterior region of my knee, and it divides into the anterior and posterior. The anterior side is going to run on the front side, and it's going to divide, or it's going to branch into the dorsalis pedis, which is then going to go to the arcuate artery, which is then going to go to the dorsal metatarsal arteries, which is then going to go to the dorsal digital arteries. Okay, so it's similar to the hand. We have arteries coming all the way down to the wrist and then out to the fingers. Now we have arteries going all the way down into the heel and ankle, into the digits, into our toes. Okay, so popliteal could also go to the posterior. Posterior now bifurcates again. It could go to the fibular or the medial and lateral, right? Fibular, however, is far apart. So we have a tibia artery, we need a fibular artery. Another word for fibular is peroneal. The fibular artery goes down the lateral side of the leg. The posterior tibial artery also branches to the medial and lateral plantar arteries. So this is similar to the hand, where we had arteries on the anterior side and the posterior side, right? Anterior, posterior. Now we have arteries on the anterior and posterior for the foot. So the medial side and lateral goes to the plantar arteries, then forms the plantar arch. The plantar arch forms the plantar metatarsal. The plantar metatarsal forms the plantar digital. So what is the difference between the plantar and dorsal, right? So plantar is going to be the bottom of my foot where I plant. I could plant onto the ground, right? So it's going to be the bottom of the foot, dorsal. No, plantar is going to be the bottom of the foot. The plantar side is on the bottom. The dorsal side is going to be on the top of my foot. The top of my foot is the dorsal side. That's all we need to know about the way the arteries flow. Now I'm going to discuss how they innervate into different muscles in the body with a diagram. Now I'm going to discuss how the arteries flow down the leg and where they innervate. So let's remember, this is the anterior side of the right leg. And this is the posterior side of the right leg, right? So these are the same exact legs, just anterior, posterior. That's why I have it drawn this way. The tibia and the tibia, they're together. However, if it was reversed, if your leg was backwards, it would still look the same, just the anterior and the posterior sides. Okay, so the abdominal aorta, right? He's going to bifurcate into the common iliac artery, right? Right or left? For the purpose of the video, we're doing right. Okay. The common iliac artery is then going to come right to this region right here. He's going to then bifurcate into two different areas. We talked about the external and the internal iliac. So before we talk about both of them, we're going to talk about the internal iliac first. The internal iliac is right here, right? This region right here. He comes down, branches off the common iliac, and then he starts to innervate parts of the muscles in the body. However, the internal iliac, he's going to pass through the obturator foramen, and he's going to innervate he's going to branch off 4 different arteries. We talked about the obturator, the superior gluteal, the inferior gluteal, and the internal pudendal, right? Okay, so first, the superior gluteal artery, he's going to supply muscles to the gluteus maximus, the deep branches of the extensor fossa latae, and the superficial branch, right? So the superior gluteal is up here. He's coming off of the internal iliac artery, and he's supplying those muscles. Next, the inferior gluteal artery. He is going to supply blood to the gluteus maximus, the obturator internus, the quadratus femoris, and the superior parts of the hamstrings. Okay, he is where? Superior is above, inferior is below. That's where he's going to supply blood to. Next, we're going to talk about the internal pudendal artery. He's going to supply blood to the external genitalia, the perineal, but not to the gluteal region. So he's going to come here, the internal pudendal artery, and he's just going to flow down this way, right, to the pubic region of the body. Next, the obturator, he's going to, unfortunately, bifurcate again. So we have the common iliac to the internal iliac, right? Internal iliac then goes to the obturator artery. The obturator artery has posterior and anterior. Okay, the anterior side is going to innervate the obturator internus, the pectineus, and the adductors of the thighs. So he's going to innervate the adductors, adding together to the body. Adductors of the thigh. The posterior side is going to do what? The muscles attached to the ischial tuberosity. So the posterior obturator artery is going to put muscles to the ischial tuberosity. So let's go over it real quick. Common iliac, internal iliac. Internal iliac, it does pass through the obturator foramen, right? This is the obturator foramen. This is the sacrum, right? he's going to pass all the way through the obturator foramen, right? But as he passes through, he branches off those 4 different arteries that we just spoke about. Now, the external iliac artery is a little bit different. The external iliac artery is going to proceed down the body, and he's going to then turn into the femoral artery. So if you see right here, I have external iliac and then femoral iliac. External iliac, femoral iliac, right? Right above the head of the femur, kind of. That's where you get the name. Okay, the femoral artery then does a few functions. He's going to do what? He descends through the femoral triangle. So if you see right here, here's the femur, here's the sacrum, right? And these arteries, this is going to be called the femoral triangle. I'm not going to really draw too much, it's going to be crazy to see, but this area, this region is the femoral triangle. Okay, the femoral triangle artery has branches that supply the anterior and the anterior-medial aspects of the front and middle thigh. So this region and this region is going to be the what? Femoral artery, the anterior and anterior-medial. Okay. The femoral artery then branches off into 3 different things. We spoke about that. We broke into the profunda femoris artery, the genicular artery, and the popliteal artery. We're going to first talk about the profunda femoris artery. This is the deep artery. So the deep artery is going to be right here, right? Profunda femoris. Here's the femoral, here's profunda femoral, right? We're going to say he branches off into 3 different things. He branches into what? The medial circumflex artery, which is going to be right here. Medial circumflex. Oh no, right here, medial, I'm sorry. Medial circumflex is the medial side of the leg. Medial. Lateral circumflex is going to be on the lateral side. Okay, lateral. And then what else does he branch into? The perforating arteries. The perforating arteries are going to be down right here. They're just going to like innervate the middle shaft of the muscles and the middle shaft of the femur. Now, what's important about the lateral and the medial circumflex femoral arteries? We said it's similar to the to the anterior and posterior humeral circumflex arteries in the arm. However, now we have lateral and medial. Okay, the lateral and medial, however, branch into 3 different arteries as well. Okay, let's talk about it. The medial circumflex femoral artery, right? It arises from the profunda femoris artery, like we said, and it's going to supply most of the blood to the head and neck of the femur. That makes sense. The medial is right here, right? It's going to do the head and neck of the femur, right? It's just innervating upwards. The transverse branch, however, transverse is going directly across, is going to take blood, and it's going to go around the artery, around the femur, right? It's going to circumflex. He's going to circumflex around, and he's going to form an anastomosis, joining of arteries, with what? The transverse branch of the lateral circumflex artery, right here. So here's medial, here's lateral. Both of them have transverse branches that help circumflex the femur, and they join together via an anastomosis. Okay, now the ascending branch of the circumflex femoral artery is going to do what? He's going to join together with the inferior gluteal artery, right, up here. Remember we talked about inferior gluteal coming from the internal iliac? Well, he's going to do the same function. The ascending branch of the medial femoral artery is going to do the same function, but he's going to anastomose with the internal gluteal artery from the internal iliac artery. Okay. Now, if we proceed down with the lateral circumflex femoral artery, the ascending branch is going to supply most of the anterior part of the gluteal region. Okay, so if here's the lateral branch, right? Lateral circumflex femoral. The ascending, going upwards, is going to supply most of the blood to the butt, the gluteal region, right? Transverse, right here, we said it, anastomosis with the medial circumflex humeral artery of the transverse branch. And then the descending branch of the lateral circumflex femoral artery joins with the genicular periarticular, right? So what is that? Genicular, periarticular are arteries that are branching off the genicular. Okay, what's the genicular? Genicular, we said, comes from where? The deep femoral artery, also known as the profunda femoris artery. So we have the lateral, medial, and now we're going to have what? Right over here, we're going to have the perforating arteries, but we're also going to have the genicular arteries. The genicular arteries are going to be down here, these pink ones, right? And the descending branch are going to join with them via an anastomosis and help to supply more blood. We're going to talk about these in a little bit though, just hold up. So, one more time, let's take it from the top. Abdominal aorta, common iliac, internal or external iliac. External goes to femoral. Femoral goes to deep profunda. Deep profunda goes to what? Lateral, medial, circumflex humeral arteries, or the perforating arteries. Here are the perforating arteries, right? Okay. Now, I also said the femoral artery branches into the genicular arteries. What are the genicular arteries? Okay, so the genicular arteries, we have 4 of them. The two of them come from the femoral side, and the other 2 come from the popliteal side. We're going to talk about the femoral side first. The femoral side forms what? The superior lateral genicular artery, and then the superior medial genicular artery, right? These are going to come around the knee. They're going to flow around the knee and support blood to the knee region, right? But what did I say they form an anastomosis with? They form the anastomosis with a descending branch of the lateral circumflex femoral artery. So here's the anastomosis with the genicular region, right? Okay, so before I move on, let's talk about what the perforating arteries do. The perforating arteries, they come from the deep profunda artery, right? And they're the majority of the hamstring muscles, and they continue down to supply the vastus lateralis in the anterior compartment, right? So they do the majority of the hamstrings and the anterior compartment of the vastus lateralis. Okay, good. Now, we have external iliac to femoral, right? Femoral goes to deep profunda. Deep profunda, or what else? The deep profunda branches into the lateral, medial, or perforating. Now, we also branch into genicular. We talked about genicular. The last thing you could branch into is the popliteal artery. So if we follow this guy down, right, we have the popliteal artery. What is the popliteal artery? Popliteal artery is going to be the artery around the knee, right? It's the knee one. And he branches into what? The posterior tibial or the anterior tibial. So now I talked about we have an anterior leg and a posterior leg. I'm going to talk about all the anterior sides, the anterior arteries on this side, and the posterior arteries on this side. So let's continue on with the anterior first. So if we start off, remember I talked about the popliteal has 2 genicular arteries branching off. They have the inferior lateral genicular branching off of him, and the inferior medial genicular branching off. What do? They surround the kneecap, right? They form anastomoses with the superior lateral genicular and superior medial genicular. Now if we continue down, we're going to have the anterior tibial artery, right? The anterior tibial artery gets its blood from the popliteal, right? It's a continuation of popliteal, and it also gets some blood from the anterior tibial recurrent. Remember recurrence or changing the blood flow? It's taking blood from the geniculars and it's taking blood to the anterior tibial artery, right? Okay, anterior tibial artery is going to proceed down the anterior side of the leg, and he's going to branch into 2 different things. Well, not 2 different things, he's going to branch into something else. He's going to branch into the dorsalis pedis, right? The dorsalis pedis is right here. It's the dorsal side, right? Dorsal side of my foot. And he's going to do what? He's going to then innervate the arcuate artery. The arcuate artery forms like this little ring, right? And this little ring is going to have branches coming off of him. Those branches are going to be called the deep plantar arteries. So the deep plantar arteries, they're going to be called the dorsal metatarsal arteries, I'm sorry. These are going to be the dorsal metatarsal arteries. They're going to be right above because it's the dorsal side. Dorsal metatarsal arteries. Let me write that. Dorsal metatarsal arteries. Okay, after the dorsal metatarsal arteries, we're going to flow into the dorsal digital arteries. The toes of the digits, right? The digits, your toes. That's going to be the last artery on the anterior side of the foot. Now, if we continue down the leg, we have the popliteal region, right? We said common iliac artery, internal iliac artery, external iliac artery, femoral artery, right? And then we have the profunda femoris artery, right? Profunda had the medial and lateral circumflex, and then it had perforating arteries. Okay, keep continuing down. We have the femoral going to the popliteal. The popliteal branches off at the adductor hiatus, right? Why does this make sense? So there's an angle from the medial condyle of our femur to the artery, right? Popliteal artery. And it forms this little angle. It's called the adductor hiatus. Adductor meaning to adduct backwards. And this angle is just called the adductor hiatus. It's a region, right? Okay. So popliteal keeps flowing down. Remember, we have our geniculars, superior medial, superior lateral, inferior medial, inferior lateral geniculars, right? So we keep flowing, and now we have a posterior tibial recurrent. We had anterior tibial recurrent, now we have posterior tibial recurrent, right? It's taking the blood from the geniculars into the posterior tibial artery, right? Okay, and now we said the posterior tibial artery does what? He bifurcates into what? The fibular peroneal or into the medial and lateral arteries. So first, let's talk about the fibular and peroneal, right? Fibular is going to be on this side. It's going to be on the fibular side. And the posterior is going to do what? Posterior tibial artery is going to go into the medial and lateral. Okay, so let's talk about their functions quick. The popliteal artery, knee, right? It's a continuation of the femoral artery at the adductor hiatus, like I said, in the adductor magnus. Okay. The anterior tibial artery is the anterior compartment of the leg, like I said, into the dorsal pedis, which are the muscles of the dorsum of the foot, first dorsal and interosseous muscles of the deep plantar artery for the formation of the plantar arch. We spoke about this. Now, the posterior tibial artery on that side, he's going to continue down the posterior and lateral compartments of the leg. They're going to circumflex around the fibular branch, and it's going to form an anastomosis around the knee. This is the nutrient artery passing down the tibia. He's going to then form the fibular, like we said, and it's going to be or peroneal, and it's going to be the posterior compartment of the leg. His perforating branches are going to supply the lateral compartment of the leg. Okay, so now, let's talk about it. Posterior tibial artery, right? He's going to flow down, he's going to have perforating branches, like we said, and then he's going to go into the medial plantar artery or the lateral plantar artery. Here's medial side of the body, and here's lateral side, right? These two arteries are then going to form the plantar arch, which is kind of like the acromion artery. It forms that little ring structure, but this time it's going to be just called the plantar arch, right? It's going to from the medial plantar artery to the lateral plantar artery. From this arch, we're going to have what? Plantar metatarsal arteries, and then from plantar metatarsal arteries, we're going to have the plantar digital arteries right down here. So this is how the arteries flow down the body. So I'm going to talk about the veins now. So I talked about the arteries in the flow chart going down, right? All the way down. So before we talk about the veins, I want to talk about the flow chart. But instead of going down, I think it makes more sense of going up because veins bring blood back to the body. Arteries bring blood away from the body. So I'm just going to start from the bottom and how everything converges. Remember we said arteries diverge, they come away? Well, veins are going to converge, they're going to come back together. Okay, so just like the arteries, the names are very similar. So first, we're going to have the plantar digital veins and the dorsal digital veins. Remember we had the plantar digital arteries right here. We also had dorsal digital arteries on the front side of the foot, the top of the foot, right? So it's the same thing, but now for the veins. They're going to take the blood. So the dorsal digital veins and the plantar digital veins are going to come together, or they're not going to come together. They're going to be joined by the plantar digital artery and the dorsal digital artery via a capillary. A capillary just takes the oxygenated blood from the deoxygenated blood, forms together, and it's a transfer, it's a switch. It's like, okay, I don't need you anymore. I'm going to pass you off. So let's think about it. The plantar digital artery has oxygenated blood, right? This little oxygen molecule gives it to a vessel or to a muscle, right? Performs its function. And then this is at the capillary. And then the artery is like, I don't want you anymore. Chucks him, gets rid of him, right? The plantar digital vein's like, I'm right over here, I want you. This is at the capillary. He takes that oxygen molecule. He's like, okay, you're not that oxygenated anymore. The hemoglobin molecule, takes that hemoglobin molecule with deoxygenated hemoglobin molecule, and he's like, I want you, I'm taking you up. So he's going to take him back up, all the way through the body, up into the heart. Okay, so we're going to start on the plantar side, right? And then I'm going to do the dorsal side. So the plantar side, we have the plantar digital vein, goes to the plantar metatarsal vein, to the plantar venous arch, right? Okay, same exact thing as the arteries, basically. Now, the plantar venous arch is going to bifurcate into two different things. I know I said they mainly diverge, or converge, but for right here, this is like one of the only times. There's two times where they diverge. So now, the medial plantar vein and the lateral plantar vein were on opposing sides of the ankle. We said that. And they're going to converge together to form an anastomosis. What did we say anastomosis was? It was the joining of arteries. Okay, so this anastomosis right here is taking all the blood from the plantar side of my foot, so the bottom side of my foot. Okay, and it's going to then diverge again, into the small saphenous vein, the posterior tibial vein, and the fibular peroneus vein, right? Okay, now if we do the dorsal side real quick, we have the dorsal digital veins, goes to the dorsal metatarsal vein, to the dorsal venous arch, right? And the dorsal venous arch is going to diverge again into dorsal pedis vein and to the small saphenous vein. Okay, let's think. The medial and lateral plantar vein became a small, anastomosis and diverged into a small saphenous vein. And the dorsal venous arch forms a small saphenous vein. They're diverging, right? But what are they really doing? Converging into the same vein. This right here and this right here are converging. They're coming together to the same vein called the small saphenous vein. I'm going to show it to you on a diagram after. Okay, so now the dorsal pedis vein can diverge one more time into the anterior tibial vein or the great saphenous vein. Okay, now this is where everything's going to come together. The small saphenous vein, the posterior tibial vein, the anterior tibial vein, right? So what's that? We have small saphenous. It's going to be deep, so I can't really show it to you. But we have anterior and posterior tibial, right? They're going to converge together with the fibular peroneus. Remember, fibular is on the lateral side, right here. They're all going to converge together and form the popliteal vein. The popliteal vein is in the knee, right? So the popliteal vein now is going to be blood flow from where? The small saphenous, the posterior tibial, the anterior tibial, and the fibular peroneus, or fibular or peroneus, Okay, now, the dorsal pedis vein, right? He branched into the anterior tibial or the great saphenous. Well, we know the anterior tibial already went to the popliteal. Okay, where does the great saphenous go? The great saphenous vein is going to travel along the medial side of your leg, right? All the way up medially, and it's going to branch into something else. Well, it's not going to branch, it's going to converge into something else, The popliteal and the great saphenous are going to both converge together into the femoral vein, right? It's a very important vein. It's right near where? The femoral artery. And where is this? The femoral triangle. Remember we spoke about the femoral triangle? Similar. Okay, so the femoral vein, right, is going to get blood from the popliteal, the great saphenous, and one more. We're missing one. The profunda femoris vein. This is the deep vein of the thigh. Just like we had the profunda femoris artery, or the deep femoral artery. Same thing, now we have the deep femoral vein. They're all going to form into the femoral vein. Okay, the femoral vein is now going to go into what? The external iliac vein. Just like the external iliac artery, but now we got external iliac vein. Okay, so now this looks all jumbled up, but let's just go through it quick. It's a pelvic region, right? The pelvic area. This was the leg area for the external iliac. If we remember the internal iliac, it's more of the pelvic region, right? Pelvic area has got superior gluteal vein, inferior gluteal vein, internal pudendal veins, obturator vein, vesical veins, lateral sacral veins, uterine veins, and middle hemorrhoidal veins, right? These all converge into the internal iliac vein. Okay, we remember where the external iliac artery coming off of or diverging off of what? The common iliac vein, common iliac artery. Now we have the external iliac vein and the internal iliac vein converging, coming together into the common iliac vein. Okay, we also had the common iliac vein bifurcating from where? We had it bifurcating from the abdominal aorta. But now, the common iliac vein, however, is not going to do that. The artery, the common iliac artery, bifurcates off of the aorta. The common iliac vein converges into the inferior vena cava. Okay, the inferior vena cava does what? The inferior vena cava brings blood back to the heart via the right atrium, right? And then this is going to go throughout the body. It's going to go right atrium, right ventricle, lungs, oxygen over here, left atrium, left ventricle, and then where? The aorta. Once it comes through the aorta, we go through down the whole process, and now we have arteries. Okay, so this is just a flow chart of how the veins flow up or bring blood back to the body on the leg side, just the lower leg, not the arm or anything, just the lower leg. Now, the arteries, I spoke about the flow chart, not the flow chart, but we went from ascending to descending. right? We just descended down. Well, now I'm going to talk about the veins ascending up, right? Because that's how blood flows, goes back to the body. So we're going to start down here, these little arteries, right? For visualization and the drawing purposes, I couldn't fit 2 feet on the board. So I have a little cartoon foot here. I'm not the best artist. So right here, we're just going to imagine that we have the dorsal and plantar digital veins. So just think the dorsal part and the plantar side, top and bottom. We're also going to imagine we have the dorsal and plantar metatarsal veins, so top and bottom, right? This comes from the digits, this comes from the metatarsals. So I just imagine we have both of them. Okay, so now, if we talk about the dorsal side first, right? Dorsal side is the top part of the foot, right? Dorsal side, we go from the dorsal digital veins to the dorsal metatarsal veins, right? Then the dorsal metatarsal veins forms a dorsal venous arch, right? This is the dorsal venous arch. The dorsal venous arch then does what? It diverges, right, into a couple things. It diverges into the small saphenous vein, which we spoke about, correct? And it also branches into the what? Anterior tibial vein, right? So we have the small saphenous and we have the anterior tibial, right? The dorsal pedis, I should have mentioned that right here, right? This is the small saphenous comes from the dorsal venous arch, right? The dorsal pedis comes from the dorsal venous arch. The dorsal pedis then diverges into 2 different things, the anterior tibial and the great saphenous vein, right? So here's the anterior tibial, and the great saphenous is this one right here, flowing all the way up. Okay, so the great saphenous vein, small saphenous vein, anterior tibial, right? Okay, now if we talk about the plantar side, we're going to talk about the bottom of the foot, right? Pretend we spoke about the plantar digital veins, the plantar metatarsal veins. Here's my cartoon foot, right? After the plantar metatarsal veins, we're going to form the plantar venous arch. Here's the plantar venous arch, right? He's going to then diverge into 2 different things. So we spoke about the medial plantar vein and the lateral plantar vein. The medial is going to be on the medial side, lateral is going to be on the lateral side, right? Remember this is the posterior side of my leg. This is the anterior side of my leg, right? Both on the right side, but this is the posterior, this is the anterior. Okay, so if this is posterior, this is the big toe, this is the medial, and this is lateral, right? Okay, so the medial plantar vein and the lateral plantar vein are going to form an anastomosis where? On the heel region, right? When they form this anastomosis, they're going to diverge into a few different veins as well. They're going to diverge into the small saphenous vein, right? He's going to flow up the posterior side. It's the same vein as the small saphenous vein coming from the dorsal venous arch, right? So the plantar venous arch and the dorsal venous arch are both going to form, the 2 veins are going to converge into the small saphenous vein, right? It's going to flow in between the tibia and fibula, kind of. Okay, also, this anastomosis from the medial plantar vein and the lateral plantar vein are going to form the posterior tibial vein, which is going to be on the posterior side of the tibia, and the fibular, or the peroneal vein, which is going to be on the fibular, right? Kind of on the posterior side as well. So these veins are going to flow up through the body, and they're going to diverge. What's going to happen? They're going to converge, What's going to happen when they converge? So we have the anterior tibial, right? He's flowing up the anterior side. And we're going to also have what? Posterior tibial, small saphenous, and fibular, right? These all converge into the popliteal vein. The popliteal vein is one of the major veins of the knee, right? So then, let's just take it back right here. What happens? Plantar venous arch, dorsal venous arch flows into the anterior tibial vein, right? Anterior side of the tibia. I have it pointed on the fibular side, but it's on the anterior side of the fibular. Saphenous vein, right? Okay, now, these converge to the popliteal from the plantar venous arch, the medial plantar, lateral plantar, the small saphenous, posterior tibial, and then the fibular. All of these 4 arteries converge into the popliteal vein. What are those 4 arteries again? Small saphenous vein, posterior tibial vein, fibular, and anterior tibial vein. This is the popliteal vein. Okay, now, the great saphenous vein came from the dorsal pedis, remember? The great saphenous vein flows up, and he's going to converge with 2 other things as well. He's going to converge with the popliteal vein, which we spoke about, comes from the back of the knee, right? the great saphenous, and then the profunda femoris vein. Remember we spoke about the profunda femoris artery, the deep artery of the thigh? Well, this is the profunda femoris vein. It's the deep side of the thigh as well. It's just a vein. All of these three converge, and they form the femoral artery. Oh, the femoral vein, I'm sorry. The femoral vein comes right here. He flows back up through the body, and he becomes the external iliac. Remember, we had external iliac artery, then femoral artery. Well, now we have femoral vein to external iliac vein. Okay. We also spoke about both of these branching together or converging to form the common iliac vein. External iliac and internal iliac vein converge together. What was the internal iliac vein? Where is all the blood coming from for this? It's coming from the pelvic area. So all the regions we spoke about, the superior gluteal vein, the inferior gluteal vein, the internal pudendal veins, the obturator veins, the vesical veins, the lateral sacral veins, the uterine veins, and the middle hemorrhoidal veins. All of these form the internal iliac. Okay, internal iliac and external iliac converge to form the common iliac vein. Remember we had common iliac artery goes to the external iliac or internal iliac. Well, now external iliac vein and internal iliac vein forms the common iliac vein. Okay, from the common iliac vein, we form the inferior, we go right up into the inferior vena cava. Okay, so remember we had the common iliac vein, it bifurcated from where? It went abdominal aorta to the common iliac, left or right, left common iliac, right common iliac. Well, instead we have common iliac going from the right side or the left side, right? And they converge together, so they come together to form the inferior vena cava. This inferior vena cava flows up through our body, and it proceeds, it puts blood right into the right atrium. It flows from the right atrium down into the right ventricle. The blood's going to go into our lungs. After it goes into our lungs, it's going to get oxygen, right? That oxygen is going to come up through the left atrium. That left atrium is going to proceed into the left ventricle. The left ventricle is then going to pump blood through the aorta. The aorta is going to then send blood to the aortic arch, which is going to go to the thoracic aorta. From the thoracic aorta, it's going to proceed to the abdominal aorta. And now we're back to the beginning. We're back to the common iliac artery, left or right. This is how blood flows throughout the body in the lower leg. That's basically it.